Inevitably, naturally, it follows that it's axiomatic that we are not going to be able to discuss everything here. It is a big, broad, to say the very least, multifaceted and complex discussion. We could have located this discussion purely on the basis of freedom of speech, its history, its roots, and why it's important, but there's a key word at the center of our discussion today, which is the notion of censorship. And just to be clear, we're going to very swiftly move into that space with the idea that it's implied that most people here will already have a sense of the history of free speech, where it emanates from, and where they don't, or where we err into legal arenas. That's what I hope to bring to the discussion today. What I wanted to do, though, from my part, is perhaps to begin with a throat clearing. And that's, if you like, what I understand, or what the best quote, if you like, that best sums up, articulates what free speech is, having drawn on all of the various thoughts on the topic from the early Renaissance onward. And interestingly, I passed it yesterday in a meeting which went horribly wrong at the BBC, and it's on a quote of a statue of George Orwell that says this, that if liberty means anything at all, it means the right to tell people what they don't want to hear. And it's a reflection on that I think is at the centerpiece of what we're going to, I hope, be discussing today. From my point of view, it's, again, I think, important more than just to throat clear, but to share with you my position on this issue, which is a clear one, and it emerged, as thoughts on this topic do, from a deeply personal history, through personal example. I can't say I thought terribly much about it. I was a human rights barrister, which is just a posh way of being a criminal barrister and charging more money. I hope that's being recorded. And I very often would come to various parts of the country, and interestingly, I passed the station like a portent on the way here. It was in Reading. I was representing a couple who were the leaders of their local chapter of the British National Party. For those of you outside of this country, they were de facto fascists. I think, Toby, you'd accept that, to be sure. I don't know why I'm suggesting you might not for a second, but there you are. Yeah. And again, if it's not immediately obvious, I mean, it perhaps should be. I arrived, and one of the first things, and I'm going to, sorry again for anybody that's disturbed by saying this, but I think in the context of the discussion we're going to have, there will be language that we're going to deploy and use here, which some people may find uncomfortable. And I think it's important in any space to make that clear at the beginning of any discussion of this kind. So when I met Margaret and John, as they were called, who were undoubtedly being abused by the police and the powers of the police, running their local chapter of this local fascist organization. John greeted me and thanked me, and he said, and I shan't forget it, I'm really glad you're here, he said, because most of the time, all the solicitor does is send me yids and queers. Now, I mean, as a gay Jew, I had to resist everything to say, do jazz hands and say, oy vey, what do you want from me? But it was also a critical moment which triggered a reaction. Like many people that go into jobs, certainly ones where you decide not to go into writing to appease the emotional tyranny of a Jewish mother, where it was going to be more comfortable to say I was a gay barrister than a gay writer. I hadn't drawn connections to the past, to the lived experiences of people around me and how that had framed my political points of view. But that was a really critical moment of appreciating their rights and what I was doing there, standing between them, those individuals, and the state, who were undoubtedly, and I repeat it, they were acquitted, by the way, of the various offenses that they were charged with, who are undoubtedly being abused by state power. And as I stood in the pretty ugly part of that court, I reflected on my own grandfather, a Holocaust survivor. Some of you may have seen the documentaries that I've made about this, but his 4 sisters, his brother and his parents were killed in Treblinka. And there were very few moments where we would discuss much. Things were said in an implied way, through jagged suggestions, in handkerchiefs left by the corner of his bed, and the way that he had a great big library on Nazi books, and so on and so forth. But there would always be lessons, never explicit, always implied. There I was, standing with Margaret and John in Reading, and I walked away, thinking I'm doing very little. And then I remembered a moment where I had stood alongside my grandfather, couldn't have been more than 7, my brother would have been 9. And he used to take us once every 3 weeks or so to Hyde Park Corner, to Speaker's Corner, where before there was anonymity and keyboard warrioring, you'd have to look into the faces of those who would espouse hate. He would go regularly. And I won't forget the moment that we stood alongside somebody who was espousing violent anti-Semitism. Now undoubtedly would have been subject, without question, to a variety of hate crime laws, for sure. Not incitement, but undoubtedly what was being said then would now be criminal. And there was a moment, standing alongside my grandfather, where he said in that Polish voice, which I miss so richly, "You see," he said, "Hess, in this country, this man can say what he wants." And I pause and reflect on that often. This is somebody that had touched the face of tyranny in the truest sense, who had lived not just under censorship, but understood what the stranglehold of being conscripted to say something or to not say something could do. And brought myself back to Reading, and for a limited period of time, that gave me mission and purpose. So my position, born out of that experience, is a species of free speech fundamentalism. The idea that within very, very narrow limits, ultimately, the cure to bad speech is more speech. But with that in mind, I'm going to turn firstly to Toby, because I think that's an important starting point for us to remain focused. And because you've written so much on this, in your view, and I know we're going to start with you and give you a lot of time to reflect on this, what are the limitations on speech? What should they be? And what injuries do they cause where they do exist in too deep or too excessive a way?
Thanks, Rob. Yeah, well, I think the standard, I think, is probably one of the best standards, is that articulated by the US Supreme Court in Brandenburg versus Ohio in 1969, whereby the Supreme Court ruled that all speech should be permitted unless it was going to lead to imminent lawless violence. And I think that's obviously quite a high threshold, and I think a good one, but one we've, I think, departed from, not only in the US, but certainly we're not upholding that standard now. A good example, you mentioned Speaker's Corner just now. I spoke at the 150th anniversary of Speaker's Corner earlier this year, and the day before, an anti-Muslim Christian preacher called Hatton Tash, quite controversial. She wears a T-shirt with one of the Charlie Hebdo cartoons on the front, and she used to be a Muslim. Now she's an apostate turned Christian preacher, and she was taunted by a mob of angry young men and assaulted, and instead of protecting her, the police arrested her, took her to Charing Cross Police Station, interviewed her on 3 separate occasions over a 12-hour period, strip searched her, kept her in their cells overnight. So it's one of the cases the Free Speech Union has taken up with the Metropolitan Police. But that's an example, I think, of how Speaker's Corner is no longer the benchmark, the showplace of free speech. I think the Nick Griffin case, the British National Party, is actually a really good argument. What's happened to the British National Party and the decline, the political decline of the British National Party, is a great argument for free speech. In 2009, the leader of the BNP, Nick Griffin, was invited to be a panellist on BBC Question Time, which, for those of you who aren't British, is one of our kind of flagship current affairs programmes. Goes out on BBC One on Thursdays at about 10:30. And there was a lot of debate about it at the time. And it was protested. There were anti-fascist protesters outside. People didn't think that Nick Griffin should be given a platform that would be legitimising his views. It would be giving him the opportunity to share some of his toxic opinions. He's a Holocaust denier, amongst other things. So it would be dangerous. But actually, he was debated on that panel by various opponents, and his ideas were shown to be toxic and often false. And it was in the immediate aftermath of his appearance on Question Time that the BNP went into sharp political decline, and it had been rising up to that point. And that's a good argument, I think, for not suppressing speech we consider hateful or false from being set out in the public square, so it can be rebutted. And one of the things I wanted to talk about was, I mean, I think that this used to be one of the kind of foundational principles of liberalism, that, as you said, Rob, the best way to rebut bad speech was not to suppress it, but to allow more speech, and that was that's known as the counter-speech doctrine, and it was set out in a Supreme Court judgment in Whitney versus California in 1927 by a Supreme Court justice called Louis Brandeis. And his famous quote is, "If there be time to expose through discussion the falsehoods and fallacies, to avert the evil by the processes of education, the remedy to be applied is more speech, not enforced silence." But one of the reasons the Free Speech Union, the organisation I founded 2.5 years ago, is so busy, and it's been kept so busy over the past 2.5 years, is that doctrine, that fundamental principle, appears to have been largely abandoned. And I'm thinking in particular of various laws which are on the point of being brought in the UK and in the EU to force social media companies like Twitter, YouTube, Facebook to remove misinformation and disinformation. So there's the Digital Services Act in the EU, which is imminent, and there's the Online Safety Bill in the UK. And the Online Safety Bill doesn't just want to make it more difficult, it's going to empower Ofcom to fine big in-scope social media providers up to 10% of their annual global turnover if they don't remove unlawful content. But in addition, there's a proposal. It's very contentious and may yet be removed, but at the moment it's included in the bill, and the bill has already had its second reading in the House of Commons, that social media companies will be also under an obligation, on pain of being fined huge amounts of money by Ofcom, to remove what the government has designated as lawful but harmful, legal but harmful speech, which is a dangerous grey area. One of the kind of principles of English common law is that if something's not explicitly prohibited by law, then it should be permitted. This seems to be a departure of that principle, the introduction of a grey area whereby something is not unlawful but nonetheless prohibited online. And one of the things the government has said, it's produced an indicative list, hasn't actually set out the definitive final version of what content will be included under legal but harmful, and this is legal but harmful to adults. They've included things like misinformation, particularly health-related misinformation. So it looks likely that that will be in the Online Safety Bill, barring some departure from this particular clause by Liz Truss, assuming she wins next month. Why is it that, across the West, there is now such anxiety about the harm produced by misinformation and disinformation, that they're prepared to effectively, that you know, even quite liberal people like President Obama gave a speech recently about this, on this very topic, are prepared to ditch, you know, the counter-speech doctrine and say, well, in limited circumstances, some censorship is justified. It's not as if the big tech social media platforms need any encouragement to remove lawful content. They do it at the moment. It's often done by algorithms, but it's done on a massive scale. So why do states, why does the EU feel it has to do more? Joseph Macham-Gama, the author of a book published earlier this year called Free Speech from Socrates to Social Media, he calls it elite panic, that there is this feeling that democracy itself is facing an existential threat because of the dissemination of misinformation, disinformation, conspiracy theories, hate speech on social media. The magnitude of the threat is so great that it warrants some censorship. And I just wanted to sort of briefly make the case against censoring misinformation. First of all, it presupposes that there is a kind of uncontentious, kind of factual truth which people who are disseminating misinformation and dissemination are departing from, which seems to me, you know, it seems to be at odds with certainly kind of modern developments in philosophy, a general skepticism about truth and objectivity. So it's slightly odd that this kind of, that the concept of misinformation, which presupposes there is such a thing as hard, uncontentious information, factual information, has gone hand in hand with increasing skepticism about truth. Can I get a glass of water? Is it? I don't want to drink out of the bottle. I'll leave it there. In addition, if the one of the reasons for censoring misinformation, disinformation, is to increase trust, it's unlikely to do that. Trust in, you know, the media, in politicians. There's quite a lot of survey evidence that people with right-of-centre views are much more likely to have their content removed by social media platforms than people with left-of-centre views. And often it's people who do end up having their content removed because it's misinformation or disinformation or designated as such, are people who challenge the wisdom of the lockdown policy, question how efficacious and safe the vaccines are, dissent from prevailing orthodoxies when it comes to things like climate change. Most of those people, you know, are right of centre, and they seem to be much more likely to be penalised by social media companies in this way, and that'll no doubt become much greater if these various laws are passed here and in the EU. So it doesn't increase, I don't think, trust. On the contrary, it makes people who don't feel that they're represented by various political and financial and social elites feel more disengaged, more disenfranchised, more pushed out. Censoring misinformation, disinformation doesn't seem to have the effect of actually making people accept the kind of various positions that, you know, the people behind these laws and who are kind of panicking about these things hope. I mean, you know, there's been an enormous amount, an enormous effort, certainly by governments across the Western world, by public health officials, in collusion with the people who run big tech companies, to suppress any skepticism about the efficacy and safety of the COVID vaccines, particularly the RHA vaccines. That doesn't seem to have in any way had the effect of reducing vaccine hesitancy. On the contrary, it seems to have increased it. So we've seen an outbreak of polio in the UK because fewer people are being vaccinated against polio. We recently saw an outbreak of measles in the US. And it just seems kind of obvious that if you don't allow people to set out their reservations about the COVID vaccines in the public square, if you kick them off social media platforms for doing so, that's not going to reassure people that they are safe and effective. people are going to think, well, what have you got to hide? Why aren't you just rebutting these criticisms in the public square? You know, why are you pushing these people out onto the margins? And, you know, and so it doesn't seem to be a very effective way of achieving the objective of making people behave in a more socially responsible, civic-minded way, which is good for democracy. And I guess just the point I wanted to end on is, you know, often when elites describe certain points of view, certain information as misinformation or disinformation, they're appealing to a standard as a way of avoiding having a kind of proper conversation. Often, what's censored is not something which is straightforwardly factually wrong, but something which challenges a prevailing narrative that people don't want to be challenged. It's as though they're having a kind of proxy battle rather than engage in a proper discussion and debate about the values, the underlying principles behind the positions they want to defend. They'll just pretend that anyone who challenges them is trafficking in misinformation or conspiracy theories. And it seems to me that the way to rebuild trust, the way to restore health and vitality to democracy is not to embrace this limited form of censorship, but to engage much more willingly in debates of a kind of fundamental philosophical nature in the public square, and not pretend that important policy issues can be just resolved by asking the scientific experts, you know, technocrats, what to do, as though there is this kind of uncontentious evidence-based policy solution which has no kind of ideological implications. Let's not pretend we aren't engaged in these big, important ideological battles by just trying to censor people who challenge our values and smearing them as traffickers in misinformation, fake news, and conspiracy theories.
Thank you, Toby. Ayishat's going to be speaking, amongst other things, on the impact that censorship has on suppressing broader conversations and the consequence of that, increasing tribalism and the potential cultural violence that can do. But it would be remiss of me not to come back at some of the things that you said, and I feel fairly sure, not least to perhaps read some of the body language in the room, my silence doesn't connote, and I don't think yours or anybody else's does, a degree of agreement with everything that you say. I think some of the things you've said are undoubtedly true, but even as a free speech fundamentalist, as I called myself, Article 19 of the Universal Declaration on Human Rights, which deals ostensibly with the idea of free speech, supposed to be adopted by every country. The most oppressive, of course, have both the clearest constitutions and the most articulate articles about what freedom of speech is. But nevertheless, that was originally instituted, I think, in the early 60s and then modified, as you'll be aware, in about 73. And that placed limitations on speech for all states, amongst other things, in the protection of national security or for broader public health. And one of the things that you would want as a journalist to ensure, or certainly you have to have some belief in, is the idea of objective truths, to be sure. And that we live at a time where dissemination of not just falsehood, but conspiracy theory can do real, or can have a real effect, not just on the body politic, but on individuals and perhaps on democracy itself. We think, for example, of QAnon and the direct line that has between individuals that went down that ugly, violent rabbit hole leading to January the 6th, for instance. The fact that in the course of some of the dissemination of what was happening in the course of the vaccine rollout, there wasn't just a case of people being cancelled for expressing skepticism, but much like the doctor who you'll be aware of, who has been struck off for suggesting without scientific foundation a connection between the MMR vaccine and autism, that there is a view that's taken that free speech does enduring social violence and damage to public health. And that's a limitation that's been accepted both in a legal framework, but in a broader sense to protect, preserve, and defend the freedom that we all share. It's a utilitarian argument, to be sure, a mill argument, the idea that it will ultimately please the greater number. It keeps us, most people, secure to know that there are some individuals that really need to believe that it's just them. But given those individuals who, much like Margaret and John I referred to before, who would otherwise be in a community of one, given they now have the capacity as individuals to shape the political agenda, to curate the cultural conversation, disproportionate power, whereas previously they may sit up all night chain-smoking Parliament and wearing a muumuu and being ignored. That has a real effect, and I'm wondering how you feel about defending those limitations, given that we live against the backdrop of those real risks, the real risk of harm and enduring injury to democracy and freedom.
Yeah, good questions. I think one of the difficulties with making a kind of safety argument, a prevention from harm argument to justify prohibiting speech is that I don't trust the authorities tasked with deciding what speech is likely to be harmful, particularly harmful to public health. And a good example, I guess, is in China in 2019, the doctors in Wuhan who first raised the alarm about the existence of this new flu-like virus that was causing pneumonia. They were immediately, their posts on the big Chinese social media platform were removed. They were rounded up, arrested, questioned, imprisoned on the grounds that they were spreading false rumors that could endanger public safety. And actually, had that not happened, had they been listened to, had the Chinese authorities been forced to respond to their ringing of the alarm bell, the viral outbreak might have been contained and many millions of deaths prevented. So I don't think they got that particular decision right. I think more broadly, I was a skeptic about the wisdom of the lockdown policy almost from the very beginning, and thought that the harms would surely outweigh the benefits. The harms seemed tangible and calculable, the benefits very uncertain because we didn't know enough about how the virus worked or was transmitted. And I think it was really difficult to have a kind of proper discussion about the lockdown policy because every time you raised doubts about it, every time you even pointed to reputable peer-reviewed research by leading medical scientists, you were accused of endangering public health. I was often accused of having blood on my hands because I'd questioned how effective actually shutting people in their homes, forcing them not to visit loved ones in care homes, not to attend funerals, weddings, and so forth. Because I'd raised reservations about that, I was accused of endangering public health, and I was, from time to time, kicked off Twitter and YouTube for doing so. And I think in retrospect, there's certainly, I wouldn't say that it's now the consensus view that the lockdown policy caused more harm than good, but I think it's definitely heading in that direction. Certainly many more people are much more ambivalent about how wise locking people down in response to a viral outbreak is than they were back then. And had there been a proper public discussion, some of the harms done by that policy, particularly to children, but to the economy as well, might have been avoided. Just on your final point about conspiracy theories, I'm not questioning that conspiracy theories can do genuine harm. My point is that suppressing them, stopping people from setting them out, kicking people off YouTube and Twitter for trafficking in conspiracy theories is not the way to defang them, to denude them of harm. And a good example, I guess, is that in the aftermath of the January 6th imbroglio, anyone claiming that the election had been stolen and that electoral fraud had been partly responsible for Joe Biden's victory, was immediately kicked off every big social media platform. And I guess the hope was, if we don't allow people to set out these conspiracy theories in public, fewer people are likely to believe them. But actually, there's no evidence that fewer people believe that that election was stolen now than they did on January 6th. And it looks as though if President Trump is a candidate in 2024, he'll win. So, you know, I agree with you about the risk conspiracy theories and misinformation pose to the health of democracy. But I think the way to detoxify them is to allow people to articulate them, set them out, and then rebut them as forcefully as possible in the public square.
So you've answered issues as far as you're concerned to the impact of some of these theories on the health of democracy, and there'll be time and room for questions. And I just want to be clear, and Ayisha, you're going to speak, just to be clear, I asked whether you wanted to talk specifically about this legal issue, and you were quite clear that we wanted to move into a different arena of conversation. So I'm going to turn to you now as we reflect on the impact of censorship and what it does to the body politic, to individuals that may want to engage in conversation, and also the book that you're currently working on.
Yeah. So it's interesting that, the theme is freedom. And when I think about, why I've come into these conversations and why I could get involved in a discussion like today, I think what's always motivated me is this yearning for freedom. And what I've noticed over time is that feels, at least for me, and I think if it feels that way for me, I imagine it does for a lot of other people. I think feeling free in the sense of not having to self-censor, feeling as though we can talk to one another about contentious issues without having to oversimplify things, without having, without this sense that different opinions imply a sort of tainted morality. That wasn't happening in the circles that I was around. So I predominantly work as a fashion stylist. And early on in my life, I was, or let's say in 2012, I went through a sort of deep psychological transformation. Some people might call this a breakdown, others may call it a breakthrough, depending on your point of view. But I came away from this experience and I was very interested in different things. I was sort of in a state where I had been questioning a lot of my life choices. I'd been questioning what brought me to styling. I was questioning a lot of things about myself. And I was looking for something. I was searching for something. I'd suddenly found that a lot of the places that I'd been in felt hollow, and I didn't see much meaning there. And meaning became something that was very important to me. And I was searching for this. I didn't feel like I'd led a life where I had prioritized other people in a meaningful way, and I wanted to be part of social change, as many people do. But being part of social change to me means pursuing the truth, and we can only pursue the truth with curiosity. And so I was on the peripheries, I would say. I wouldn't say that I was deeply invested in any sort of social justice movement, but I was definitely on the peripheries and at protests, and I was just searching, trying to find out what people cared about and why some of the issues that we face in society, where they were coming from. And I quickly learned that wasn't possible amongst a lot of people. I quickly discovered that there was a sort of ideological position that people wanted you to have, and it felt as though in a process to stamp out bigotry, we punished curiosity. And curiosity to me is a fundamental element of freedom. And where my book comes from is, it comes from, understanding that we're living in a time right now where I think a lot of people feel the need to self-censor. And I think that is very dangerous to a lot of important conversations. As far as race goes, as far as gender goes, identity itself has not felt to me like, at least identity in the current ways that we are thinking and talking about identity, it doesn't feel like a site of freedom. It feels like a site of conformity. And I really want to encourage that we can speak freely. And I don't think this is something that we can do online. And I do think that many people are living in a profound state of fear, sometimes about stating what to me feels quite obvious. And yeah, this is where I chime with and agree with Toby on a lot of what he says. For me, I do think the way to combat bad ideas or, ideas that potentially could be harmful is to have them in public. I think when we drive them underground, you make them a lot more attractive. You don't get rid of them. I think it gives its own legitimacy to those ideas in many ways, because I think people in those groups who might be sprouting and espousing these types of ideas, they suddenly feel vindicated, you see? So it's kind of like, you see, they're trying to shut me down, and this sort of lends this idea that what I'm saying is so truthful and so powerful that the establishment is trying to stop me. And so I think that we should, and especially for younger generations, it saddens me to see a state now where in universities in particular, where I notice this, where we're deplatforming speakers that we think are harmful, and harmful is very subjective in many ways. What someone else finds harmful, another person finds enlightening. But even if those ideas were harmful, I think what we protect, we don't just protect the people in the audience, but what we do is we shield that speaker from being able to be challenged in ways that are important. And so, yeah, for me, I really do feel like there is a problem, with the ways that we are conceptualizing identity now. I've often said, and maybe this is why I also felt compelled to speak about these issues, and I guess they're all somewhat social justice based, but, there's a big effort to protect people like myself, or to give people like myself more freedom. And when I say people like myself, I mean a woman, being black, being gay. But for me, I don't think that I've never felt more unfree in this space, and I think there are a lot of black people, a lot of women, a lot of people who have an alternative way of expressing their gender. I think for those people in particular right now, actually, a lot of them, should I say, our effort to protect is actually quite suffocating. And so, yeah, I'm interested in how we get away from that. And my book and a lot of the writings that I've shared online is in an effort to do that and to think about, actually, why are these ideas so attractive? Why are we trying to protect people, in ways that are really suffocating and end up causing people to self-censor, which I think is really detrimental psychologically and emotionally.
Hearing what you say, and again, because we can't unpick everything, but I hope there's going to be a variety of questions. Certainly, we have people here from a variety of universities who I suspect may challenge some of the premises and the various things you've had to say. I would, for instance, but I was very interested in two things that you just said. This idea of never feeling more unfree, which, bearing in mind the theme of our collective here today, is a very important thing. I was wondering if you could unpick a little bit more. And secondly, a question which we have Yuval here and others, and I wonder whether, having attended a number of demonstrations and sat alongside, heard, and imbibed these different forms of social justice activists and activism, much of which, I should be clear, I support actively. I wonder whether one of the impacts of social media, perhaps, is that it's stopped people being able to have a conversation with somebody not just because it's not there and so they are in an echo chamber, which we understand, but also that being forced to face somebody at least conscripts you into seeing the other person's humanity, that you accept they may be a person of goodwill. And that's a fundamental ingredient of a conversation. And secondly, that how you sit politically has perhaps shifted from the logical cortex of the brain, some research on this as well as I understand it, to the emotional hemisphere where your identity rests. So if I challenge you on something fundamental about perhaps a central edict, a fact that makes up your activism, it's not something that you can sit with and perhaps reflect on. I'm doing violence to you and perhaps even challenging the very basis of your identity. It's threatening. And I wondered whether you experienced that amongst some of the community of activists as well.
So what you're saying is, have I experienced people who feel like challenging some aspect of what they've kind of held dear to them, if it feels violent to them?
Yeah, and being unfree as well.
Well, when I say unfree, I think increasingly, I think, being, the words black man or black woman, essentially, let's say the words black woman and white man, I think are very loaded, these days. I think they come with a lot of assumptions and generalizations. And if you question any of those generalizations, are they useful? Are they true? I think, you sort of out yourself as a bit of a suspect. You out yourself as someone who might not be interested in change. And that's why I say I feel unfree in a certain sense. I mean, internally, let's say, I feel a great sense of freedom. But what I mean is when I'm around people, I do sometimes, as much as I think a lot of people would consider me to be outspoken, there is a way that I feel like I've had to frame things that I've said online in ways that are somewhat general, somewhat vague, because I know hitting on specific targets will, unleash something that I would find unhelpful emotionally. And so that's what I mean by unfree. I can't speak plainly. I often I feel the sense that I have to talk around things. I feel the idea that if I was to suggest that, some of the racial disparities that exist in society may not always be, or at least we should explore the possibility that they may not always be down to institutional racism, but other things, whether it be cultural factors and stuff like that, different interests and all these types of things. I feel that that is now considered threatening for some reason, and I don't think it's always been that way. I feel ever since the sort of prevalence of social media and since it's become a staple in our lives, as much as this thing has meant to connect us, I think it's disconnected us in the sense that it's disconnected us from seeing other people charitably, and that's what I mean by I feel a sense of unfreedom. I feel like my identity in many ways, or at least according to a lot of people, has locked me into something, or they want to lock me into something. It feels like people want to lock me into a position that doesn't fit. And that's what I mean when I say I feel a sense of unfreedom, at least in the public square these days. And when you're talking about this sense of violence, that people feel, I mean, I think I fundamentally reject that for myself. I mean, I enjoy being challenged. I enjoy being questioned. I enjoy things that I actually hold dear and quite sacred. I enjoy having to rethink them. And so, the fact that we draw for that kind of language so soon now, to me seems to be symptomatic of this deeper problem to engage with reality in many ways. And when I say engaging with reality, engaging with the fact that, I don't see how we can truly appreciate diversity if we can't appreciate that people have diverse minds, if we can't appreciate that people are going to see the world differently. I find it to be quite anti-human in lots of ways, and very anti-freedom.
Now, it may be anti-freedom, but there is a reason, there is a mind behind what some people would call censorship or suppression or whatever the legal intention is, it's always to, as we would say in the law, to prevent mischief or harm. And by the it, we need to describe the space that we're talking about. We've chiefly spoken here about social media platforms, so private companies and the extent to which they're publishers. We've spoken about platforming in university, less so, but in printed medium as well. The question is the extent to which this is a problem and why governments are trying to legislate. And it seems, and this is usually the stated case, in debates, in what they say, which you should, of course, read on the face of the legislation, that speech, by its very nature, can be a form of violence to a variety of communities. And the barometer of that is assessed not objectively, but by the communities who experience that speech themselves. To what extent do you think that's a rational, fair, and reasonable basis to make legislation? And to what extent, Toby, do you think that that enhances or undermines freedom?
Well, I think, I guess, on the one hand, it's a source of hope that people who want to limit speech appeal to harm, J.S. Mill's harm principle, that the justification for prohibiting speech is the prevention of harm. But what isn't so encouraging is the more and more expansive definition of harm. And it takes kind of two forms. I guess one form it takes is suggesting that allowing someone to speak will lead to a chain of events which will eventually lead to violence being done to someone or that person doing violence to themselves. So often the argument for no platforming gender-critical feminists is that if they challenge trans rights orthodoxy, that will lead to more violence being done to trans people and lead to higher rates of suicide and self-harming amongst trans people. And one of the critical things in the Supreme Court test is imminently lead to lawless violence. So that wouldn't pass that test. That wouldn't be considered a good reason in America under the First Amendment for prohibiting speech. It has to imminently lead to lawless violence. It can't be part of some vague, hard to define chain, which eventually or might potentially lead to. But even when you know people who want to prohibit speech, which may eventually lead to violence, are challenged on this, they'll come back and say what you just set out very clearly, which is they'll claim that okay, gender-critical feminists saying things that make that undermine trans rights orthodoxy is in itself a form of violence. That just having to listen to those words is harmful. I no longer feel safe. I no longer feel part of this protected community. This is, I mean, it came up when Rod Liddell was recently, there was a huge kerfuffle at the University of Durham when Timothy Luckhurst, the head of one of the colleges at Durham, invited one of my colleagues at The Spectator, Rod Liddell, to give an after-dinner speech. And he was his usual provocative, controversial self. And many of the students walked out. They actually walked out before they'd heard what he had to say, and then claimed that what he'd had to say made them feel unsafe. And they said, "This is our home. We don't expect to be made to feel unsafe in our home." And it was this kind of this idea that merely hearing things you find disagreeable, having your beliefs and values challenged by somebody else, is in itself a species of harm that can be invoked to justifiably restrict that speech. And I guess one thing I'm really curious about is, well, how do we persuade, you know, people like the protesters who walked out when Rod Liddell got up to speak and claimed hearing him made them feel unsafe? how can we persuade them to be a little more reasonable? And it's kind of quite hard to work out what's going on. Do they really think that listening to Rod make a few stupid jokes is actually going to endanger their psychological well-being, make them literally less safe? Or are they weaponizing their claims to be mentally fragile as a way of asserting their power in a kind of passive-aggressive, cry-bullying way? And I'm always kind of, I always find it hard to figure out what's really going on. To what extent should we take their claims to feel unsafe at face value? And to what extent is it just a kind of political, rhetorical maneuver that we should probably not try and engage with, in a kind of rather kind of direct, quotidian way?
Yeah, well, I think about this quite often too, because it definitely hasn't always been this way. I was in university in, I think I started maybe in 2009, 2010, and we had a range of speakers, and this was not the language. And this is an issue with language shifting in the ways that it has, is that it changes how we feel about these situations. So I do think that these people, what we used to call discomfort is now unsafe. And I think because our sense of being good people now is tied to our positions on social justice, I think if people feel as if if people allow others to know that they are capable of entertaining and listening to conversations with people who are controversial, I think they feel implicated. And so I don't often think it is a case that people feel unsafe. I think people are worried about what it means to listen to such speakers in public, what that will say about them as individuals. Does that now mean that if you listen to a gender critical feminist, that you're against trans rights? And because I think we have such a black and white worldview, and we all can kind of understand there's a currency in victimhood in many ways. It very much works online. I think we don't feel as if our arguments or our positions have legitimacy if we're not sort of perpetually acting as though we are under threat. Maybe we feel as though people won't take us seriously. And so I think it has more to do with what we think others are thinking. We don't want to be outed as a bad person, and that these smears of bigotry, the many that exist, they're applied very liberally, and people don't want to be ostracized. And then this is the ways that I feel, freedom, is truly, in a very precarious state at the moment, because, we're so conscious, of what other people feel about us. And I understand why, because it's not just the case anymore of, okay, well, I agree, I believe this, and you believe that. It's now about, who you are as a person. It's an attack on your character. So no, I don't truly believe that a lot of people genuinely feel unsafe. The same people that I've often met who tell me they feel unsafe, or will act as though they feel unsafe in a public conversation, will have that conversation with me privately, easily. All the time. Like I said, I'm in environments where most of my friends are pretty radical leftists. I'm pretty much the only one who I wouldn't say is like that. And I have these conversations with them privately, but they won't necessarily engage with me online, because engaging with me online may suggest something about them. So I think it's about belonging and wanting to seem like a good person. And I think being a good person today is very much about what you believe rather than how you behave.
Yeah, no, I think that's very true, and there seems to be a connection. I mean, it's so obvious that it's almost become a cliche between the decline of Christianity and the rise of the woke cult. And as Christian worship, church-going has radically declined over the past 25 years or so. So you've seen these identitarian movements sweep in to fill that God-shaped hole that's no longer been filled by organized religion, Christian worship in particular. Though if that's true, you'd think that Anglican bishops would be less susceptible to kind of ideological capture because they don't have a God-shaped hole for the woke religion to fill, but actually they do seem as vulnerable as everyone else. Maybe it's because they don't really believe in God. But I want to pick up on one thing you said, which I thought was really interesting, which was that there's this sense that if you engage with a political opponent, someone with a radically different point of view to yours, you will in some way become contaminated. That if you allow them into your space, that toxifies your space. And that comes up again and again, actually, in various cases the Free Speech Union gets involved in. I mean, there was one famous case we weren't involved in, it happened before we were formed, but Jordan Peterson had been invited to give a series of lectures at Cambridge University on the Bible. And then a picture circulated of him standing next to a fan at one of his big speaking events, wearing a T-shirt saying, "Proud Islamophobe." And, you know, someone gets up to have their photograph taken with Jordan Peterson in the aftermath of these events. There's like one person every 15 seconds, and he doesn't control it. There's no kind of selection process. They pay to be photographed with him. But nonetheless, because he was standing next to someone with this T-shirt on, he was thought to be infected by this kind of toxic view. And because he was infected, he was cast out. And he was no platform, not allowed to give that series of lectures by the university and by the theology faculty and by the students' union. And there's this sense, you know, it's often referred to as alt-right adjacent, as though, or transphobe adjacent, as though just standing next to someone means you can be infected by their kind of toxicity. And it seems to me that suggests that it used to be a kind of psychological cliche, that the reason some people became conservatives and others liberal is because the conservatives were kind of anally retentive. They had a more developed disgust instinct. That's why they were concerned about migrants. They were concerned about sexual deviance, because they were kind of these buttoned up, male, pale, and stale men. And whereas liberals were much more open, much more open to new experiences, much less concerned about policing borders and boundaries. But it seems to me that disgust instinct has kind of traveled now and seems to be one of the key hallmarks, certainly, of the kind of identitarian woke left. They have this kind of almost existential terror of being infected by a contaminant that enters their community, in much the same way that, you know, conservatives of old were kind of concerned about immigration or homosexuality. And that seems to be a sort of interesting new development. It's no longer true that it's just conservatives who have this overdeveloped disgust instinct. It also seems to be true, if not more true, of the kind of far left.
I don't really know where to start. So I won't. Safe to say, I disagree with a good deal with what you say, but I support your right to say it. I'm going to facilitate the discussion, move it to Ayisha. I think it's more fruitful over there. It's interesting, and I wondered if you could speak to more the sort of idea of your virtue, your public virtue, being connected by only having discussions with and being alongside people who share your views in order to, and this might perhaps extend your religious metaphor, however flawed that might be, which we will talk about, no doubt, outside later on. I mean, you should be aware of the number of people, for instance, especially young people, who were praying in lockdown, for instance, very interesting research and data. But that's a whole nother issue. I'm fascinated by that idea, the sort of purity of thought, but also that there may be something much more virtuous at the heart of this activism. That for especially minority communities, there are for them, insofar as I have represent or come from two of those communities perhaps. There's class communities as well, and those dynamics which of course have to be considered as well. Don't include that. But nevertheless, that there are certain discussions, certain issues, which, though you can have them, shouldn't be up for discussion in the public square, that they do by their very nature lack virtue, and that especially in private spaces, it's perfectly reasonable for private companies, for universities to say, by all means, find another space to go and espouse your views. But here we have a framework, a constitution, which fundamentally protects the rights of individuals. And let's use one catch-all word, which I'm going to say the left, it often picks up this stone, I think wrongly, and throws it and dilutes its meaning. But fascist views, for example, are unacceptable in our space, on our platform. And you can't have a reasonable conversation with a fascist, or if you can, you don't do it in a space which is supplying the virtue by giving you the platform in the first place. Don't mean in the BBC, but I mean at a university or online, because then that private company, then that university becomes indelibly associated with that view. It enables it, it supports it, it aids and abets that view. And I wonder whether you can perhaps sort of understand why for many people there are a buffet of views which perhaps sit outside of what's tolerable and acceptable. And for them, they do fundamentally lack any virtue and consequent threat.
Completely. And if we were talking about genuine fascist views, then I could understand that. But I think in many cases, we're not talking about fascists. And fascists, at least in the digital arena, is very broad. Gender-critical feminists are not what I would consider to be fascists. Yet these are a lot of the women who are being deplatformed, who are being vilified and demonized at rapid rates constantly. So, of course, I would understand if there was a speaker who was homophobic and felt as though, every gay person should go through conversion therapy and were a deep threat to children and so on and so forth. I completely understand why giving that speaker a platform in a university space would probably, wouldn't be helpful and wouldn't be useful in any way. But that's not what we're talking about a lot of the time, and when there are genuine, I personally don't think I've seen genuine instances of where I've seen, those types of views being aired on campuses. So yeah, when I see that, then I would completely concede, but that's just not what I'm seeing too much of. What I'm seeing is people who are unpopular. I'm seeing people like the Jordan Peterson types, who again, yes, of course, I'm sure he does attract a lot of, let's say, wounded young men, but many movements, attract wounded people. And so yeah, I just don't think that a lot of what we're seeing is, genuinely what we can call, fascist. I know Judith Butler, the gender theorist, proposes that gender-critical feminists, are fascist, or it's a branch of fascism. And I just don't think that is true. Yeah, so yeah, I of course I understand, I come from those communities, that are marginalized. But to assume that every person in a marginalized community isn't open to, actually wanting to challenge these people, actually wanting to, have it out with them. Again, I think sometimes there's a sort of protectionist angle that can just be quite condescending to a lot of people who are very curious and want to find out where these ideas come from.
I'm going to now open it up to the floor. I'm sure there's going to be lots of questions, but I feel like seeing as we are in a safe space, sorry Toby, I have to kind of make a concession here, that you said something before, Ayisha, and it's something that was echoed by you, Toby. I've had to, as I've listened to the two of you, reflect on how unfree I feel in the context of this discussion. Tomorrow morning, or where are we, Saturday, so 2 days' time, I'll be presenting Breakfast Telly on ITV, right? And the reason I tell you that is because I'm really mindful that this conversation here, this space, is a very you can't be very existentially threatening. It is an existentially threatening one. This is a dangerous conversation. I'm looking around the room at faces, and I have to say, there feels to be a degree of physical and emotional animus in the context of this conversation, which we won't get in the context of other philosophical discussions about freedom. And that, by its very nature, I think is something that is important for us to reflect on. Some of the things you're saying about trans communities there, I feel aggressively that I want to respond. I want to talk about kindness. I want to talk about manners. The things that you were saying about religion I felt were fundamentally wrong. I wanted to attack you, not least because this is on camera, so I wanted something to defend myself in the event this went viral on Twitter. And I think that's a really important thing to concede, that this is a really difficult and unsafe conversation itself, where I feel worried that this is going to be partly clipped. You know, Rob Rinder, right, exactly, in whichever, or by the nature of chairing this debate itself. And so I just wanted to share that with you because I can feel it in the room. And it's, by its nature, I think, a quality example of a lack of freedom. Perhaps I'm wrong, but any questions?